Yeah.
skills really high,
Of course.
which is like attention to detail. Quick start, which is your ability to actually follow a task through.
Yes.
Follow through.
Yeah. So the main emphasis, like, so human behaviour is hard to predict because people have got a range of choices. That's the difficult about predicting human behaviour, because you've got a range of choices at any moment in time that you can choose. So right now you can choose a number of things, and that's the sort of challenge you've got at every moment. So we'll look at the big 5 broad categories of personality traits, and I suppose, you know, the societal influences, chemistry can impact on your mood and motivation. What you see influences what you believe, your perception. The big 5 traits are best accepted and most commonly used model of personality in academic psychology. Okay, they come from statistical responses, studies of personality items, you know, using a technique called factor analysis. Okay, which I won't go into today. You can email and give you more information on factor analysis. Okay, so it's a relatively robust system, scientific way. So research can look at the responses. So research can look at responses of hundreds of people, and what's the best way to summarise an individual in one respect. So this has been done with many samples from around the world, and generally speaking, there's unlimited personality variables in that respect, but 5 stood out. Okay, in terms of explaining a lot about people's, or a person's answers to questions about their personality. So think for a moment now, okay, what defines who you are? I just want you to think for like 30 seconds or so. You know, what defines who I am? You know, who actually am I? You know, easy question, do you think? Not easy, is it? So the big 5 are not associated with any specific test. There's a variety of measures that have been developed to measure them. Okay, the model, the 5-factor model, was developed by McRae and Costa. So McRae and Costa. If you want literature on the background to it, how they got to where they are, email me. I can send you one of my old dissertations, and you can sort of see. But I don't have time to sort of go into the whole background for you forever. So we're sort of going to go into the sort of nuts and bolts of it all. Lewis Goldberg, which describes personality in terms of 5 broad factors, so you refer to them as the big 5, and developed the IPIP. If you go to the International Personality Item Pool, it's an inventory for researchers to go on, and you'll see descriptive statements relating to each trait. If you go to the IPIP, you can sort of see within each factor a set of individual traits that relate more specifically to aspects of personality. So it's worth, if you get time to go on there. The big 5 markers from the IPIP. So the two main ways and the two main assessment protocols. There's a lot of them out there. So you've got the Goldberg, the IPIP, and you've got also the NEO by McRae and Costa, or the NEO PIR, as it sort of got revised, the model got revised, which we'll go into short detail in 203. So the big 5 are not associated with any specific test. There are a variety of measures that have been helped to deliver, to measure them. They're not related to any specific test. There are different ways to measure them. If you want more information on that, do feel free to email me. They don't always agree with the labels, which we're going to go into. It's not always, the labels. The research suggests that they're both biological and environmental influences play a role in shaping personalities. Does everyone agree that biology and the environment has an impact? So we talked yesterday about the rat licking experiment. So, you've got rats that are licked in the first week, behave differently to the ones that aren't. So you've got gene, and then you've got, so if you study twins, that'll sort of give you an idea of the correlation. So you've got twins, same DNA, and then one goes on to do one thing and one the other. So the environment shapes them to a point. Okay. So what's the 5-factor model useful for? To understand and predict relationships between personality traits success in social, academic, professional circumstances, useful for that. One criticism, we must look at the criticism, is that it's data-driven and not based on psychological theory. It's data-driven. The early evidence supporting a five-factor model was published by Fisk in 49. So as early as that, and you've had like a progression and research over a number of years. 80s and 90s, a vast array of research combined to support the five-factor model. Okay, not everyone agrees on the naming of the traits, which is not surprising really, because you've got these sort of labels which could mean different things to different people. So it's commonly measured. The five-factor model is commonly measured by the NEO mentioned and the NEO PIR. So the inventory was revised over time. Okay, it reports on 6 subcategories of each big 5 personality traits, which we'll go into shortly. So the revised version began in 78 with a publication by Costa McRae, and that was revised, updated in 85, 90, and 205. Hence you got the NEO PIR, so the personality inventory revised in that period there. Okay, so it comprises of 5 personality traits. Actually, as it happens, there's another one that's been introduced, but we'll go into that later on and go from there. So there's loads of instruments out there. You go on the internet, you'll see loads. Some you've got to pay for, some you can sort of get free resources too as well. So send me an email, I can send you a link to some sort of resources that you can have. They're not my resources, but resources that I've sort of utilised in the past to do my own research, which is, but generally speaking, the McRae and Costa NEO is seen as one of the most respected ones. And the IPIP is one that's used by researchers anyway. So human beings are complex. We've sort of established that. Complex in the sense that we talked about the brain yesterday, the complexity of the brain, not easy to predict. The human being is an open system. We're always changing and adapting to the environment. Okay, so this is the sort of public domain you can go to, the IPIP address you can sort of go to. You'll find big 5 items in public domain available for researchers. So you can do your own independent research on there. You choose to. Everyone got that? Okay. Yeah. Okay. So how much of our traits is determined by genetic? Well, you'd probably say about 50% as a ballpark figure. That's not the same for every trait. Okay? And that's not the same for everybody. But let's say nature, nurture, a bit above. So you've got, what you're born with, and then the environment is going to shape the genes you've got to a point. So for example, if 2 twins were born in the same country, let's say they were born in America, 2 twins, and 1 twin was moved away to a country which had completely different values and beliefs, and they might be different. Yeah. Exactly. So, genes are one thing, but they might still carry certain traits as well. And they're stable, these traits, apparently. They're quite stable. So if you're one trait at a certain age, you're very likely to be that same trait. So if you're neurotic at 15, there's a very good chance you'll be neurotic at 50. You might not be as, but there's a very good chance you will be. They're quite stable, so the research says. Okay, I think, this is my opinion, I'm sort of tell you my opinion, I think that it's too complex and rich for any one instrument. Any way, any assessment that anyone uses to explain behaviour or personality, you sort of take it what it is. That's my sort of take on things in terms of behaviour, irrespective of the research and how technically valid it is. I think that any one system is just taking on too much to say, well, this is this and this means that. The linear. The personality assessments, I think, can help create a neutral language around personality diversity and help enhance team relations. I think it's useful for that. Okay, and what would you say, for example, let me sort of throw something out to you, a hypothesis, which I sort of throw out to students all the time. A trainer, a teacher, a lecturer, do you think they're an extrovert or an introvert? would you say a trainer would be? An extrovert or an introvert? Personality.
Extrovert.
You would say that, wouldn't you? You would say, and you know what? Most students would say what you said, extrovert. However, what I would say is that it could be wrong. And the reason being is that as a trainer, lecturer, speaker myself, I'm going to speak from my own experience, I'm quite an introverted person. And many people in my field are quite introverted too, because we spend a lot of time on our own doing research and like doing it. Do you think an extrovert would like to spend hours on end doing research? No, they want to be around people. They want to sort of be type thing. So, you know, you kind of sort of think, well, there is a continuum there. But the point being is that my issue sometimes, if they're not used well, the wrong person might not get the job. You might make an assessment that, okay, well, actually, an extrovert should get the job as a trainer, but you realise, actually, you know what, I might be better given the job to... Does that sort of make sense sometimes? You can sort of... Yeah. So there is that too, and I think we've not used well these things. And I'm not sort of implying that they're not used well, but from what I've seen many different behavioural and trade assessments over many years, and it's like, you know, all of a sudden one thing becomes gospel and this is it. And I think, well, okay, bit of a danger there. To be more competent than human beings as you do. So, you know, each trait has 6 facets, we're going to cover shortly, and different ways to measure the traits, as I mentioned before, the NEO-PIR and the IPIP. Okay, there are 2 ways. There are other ways too, but there are 2 ways, 2 popular ways to measure. So you've got each trait and 6 facets. Okay, everyone okay? We're good so far? Yeah. And the 5 factors are conscientiousness, neuroticism, extroversion, agreeable, and openness. We are going to go into more detail. Before we go into more detail, let's look at the facets. Okay. So, the NEO-PIR facets and the IPIP sometimes differentiate. So I'm going to go and name each facet. Okay. So the 6 facets for the NEO, let me just say NEO for sure, is competence, order, dutifulness, achievement, striving, self-discipline, and deliberation. For the IPIP, it's self-efficacy, efficiency, orderliness, dutifulness, achievement, striving, self-discipline, cautiousness. So there's a slight variation. So if you sort of go online and you check the IPIP, the facets sometimes are different. You see here, there's a difference. Order, orderliness, deliberation, cautiousness. So the facets are slightly different in the 2 different models. Okay. The neuroticism, I'm going to go into more detail what they entail, by the way. I just want to sort of cover the 5 and the facets first of all. And really, emotional stability, the NEO, anxiety, hostility, depression, self-consciousness, impulsiveness, vulnerability, the IPIP, anxiety, anger, depression, self-consciousness, immoderation, vulnerability. So they're not really pathological, by the way, and that anxiety is not a straight linear relation to the anxiety that you're really aware of in the pathological sense. There's slight variation of that, which I'll explain later, but they're the sort of 6 facets for that. Extroversion, the NEO, warmth, gregariousness, assertiveness, activity, excitement seeking, positive emotions. IPIP, friendliness, the same, assertiveness, activity level, excitement seeking, cheerfulness. So the facets sometimes are named differently in the IPIP. Agreeableness, the NEO, trust, compliance, altruism, straightforwardness, modesty, tender-mindedness. The IPIP, trust, morality, altruism, cooperation, modesty, sympathy. The openness, the NEO, fantasy, aesthetics, feeling, actions, ideas, value. IPIP, imagination, aesthetic interest, emotionality, adventurous intellect, liberalism. So there's been a 6th added, the hexaco, honesty, humility as well, and that sort of came into the frame. And if you can read that research paper by Lee K. Ashton, 204, I can send you a link to that if you email me, and it makes for interesting reading. So to reiterate, there's the 5-factor model, and we've sort of touched on the different traits: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism. Okay, so the model comprises of 5 traits, but there are 6 facets to each trait, and we've looked at the NEO and the IPIP, and the 6 facets sometimes have a different name in the 2 different models. Okay. If you think acronym OCEAN, that's one way to remember it. Think OCEAN. So the acronym OCEAN, O is openness, C, conscientiousness, E, extroversion, A, agreeableness, and N, neuroticism. So I think acronym OCEAN. That's one way to remember it. You sort of, okay? So let's sort of think again, what makes you unique? What makes you you? What do you think makes you unique? What makes you you? What makes you as unique as your own thumbprint? And everybody else for that matter. Big question, isn't it?
What do you think?
Well, there's no right or wrong answer. But it's quite fascinating, and some established methods used by psychiatrist researchers to test and study personality traits are this model itself. Okay. So, let's sort of go into some detail before we do an exercise shortly and discuss different things. So conscientiousness, sort of very briefly, we'll go into more detail as we sort of go along. Extreme conscientiousness is associated with perfectionism and difficulty making decisions. I'm not looking at anybody. But you can sort of see, and I think for me, obviously, we sort of share these sort of traits with some people do to a point, albeit, we sort of on a continuum it might be different to each other. But I can tell you now, for example, you don't need to be a rocket scientist to know that Hale's really conscientious, Suzanne's really conscientious. Best of the group, I don't know that well to make that judgment, but I would think that based on the experience and what you do, you're going to be a high level of conscientiousness. There's indicators, which I'll sort of talk about as you go along, even outside any assessment, just even behaviourally what you do is a strong indicator too. Okay, so the extroversion, they get high scores, enthusiastic, outgoing, excited, and introverted gets low. So the extroversion gets low scores on quiet, alone, and independent. Yeah, okay, that sort of resonate anybody? Okay, so extroversion, the highest scores are enthusiastic, outgoing, excited. So extroversion, do you think extroverts like to be around people or be on there? Yeah, the energy, don't they? They get the energy. So being around people. What do you think extroversion feels when they're on their own?
Lonely.
Yeah, they could do that, for sure. So
not knowing what to do with themselves.
yeah, so they get the buzz, don't they? Being around people, extroverted. Extroverted enjoy going to a party, do you think? Or they probably would enjoy going to a party, wouldn't they? So the low scores are quiet, alone, independent. Okay, so just have a think, and we'll go into more detail where you think you might be on here from an extroversion point of view. Who thinks that score high, extrovert? Who thinks that score?
I like both of them.
Okay. And you may be context as well, but you're going to have a tendency, generally speaking, to okay, which we'll go in more detail. Neuroticism. High scores, stress, worry, negative emotion. Okay, low emotional stability. Okay, we're going to go into more detail, by the way, but that's a general rule. The scores are high, low in those areas. And have the time to think about it. And you can sort of, think about it. Who would score high? Stress, worry, the emotional stability. Okay. Yeah. You're right. Yeah. Okay. Conscientiousness that we talked about. So the conscientiousness person is self-organized, self-directed, controlling, probably low in spontaneous and carelessness. That's going to score low in those areas. So the conscientious person, by the way, is going to be well organised, directed, and want to have element control on things. Low on spontaneity, carelessness. So agreeableness, by the way, they score high on trust, empathy, compliant. Okay, low on hostility. Low on hard to emphasize, so they tend to score high on the trusting element. There are some research suggests that some research papers I've read that women tend to be higher on agreeableness. Okay, it's obviously debatable, but some of the research points towards that. Okay, which we'll talk about shortly, and the implications of that. Okay, who thinks that they sort of would score high on agreeableness? Who thinks that they sort of score high? Or things that score low on it,
Can I just go back to it? Sorry again.
Okay, yeah.
I think I'd score higher on that.
Yeah. I think so. I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely higher on agreeable.
Yeah. So some jobs are going to be more suited to being agreeable, some aren't. Okay. Which is sort of a useful way to look at things. Openness, trait, high in creativity, open to new experiences. Low, practicality, conventional, skeptical, they score. So openness, you're sort of creative, you open to new experiences and new things, and openness person, and I'll score low on practicality, conventional, skeptical. Okay, anyone think, just as a general rule, as a sort of, okay, do you think you score higher? Okay. I think so. I think you would, yeah, for sure. I think for sure.
That to me is too.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting you say it. That's really, it's fascinating you say it. It's sort of like, it's really interesting that you say it, and you can sort of see even just behaviourally who's going to score what and where on certain continuum, and obviously you've experienced new things, but it's really fascinating, and definitely I think you score really high on that area for sure. Based on your experiences and the way. And it's interesting stuff,
Crazy experience.
Yeah. Well, maybe you want to call them that, but so there are 5 basic dimensions of personality. Often they're referred to as the Big 5. It's probably the most scientific. Well, it is the most scientific personality test trait there is. So it was invented. So the inventory was developed by Costa McRae in '92. Okay. So if you read the paper on Sullivan and Meyer, who first introduced the concept of the I in 1990, they sort of focus as a correlation between the big thing these days is emotional intelligence and the Big 5. We're going to go into that actually on the weekend, for those who stay on the weekend, around the correlation between the Big 5 and emotional intelligence. We're going to sort of go into more detail how there is a correlation there, and how obviously people challenge the idea of emotional intelligence. There's a big critique, and some people critique it saying, well, actually it's just this rehashed to a point. So we'll look at that and touch on that, the significance of that, going forward, which is key. So according to research around personality traits, they have a biological base. Okay, if someone's neurotic at 15, they'll be neurotic at 50. So
is that like the marshmallow test thing? Is that where that sort of comes
well, the marshmallow test was an impulse test, and that was the marshmallow experiment was an impulse test that was done at university. That was like a separate to this. And what the marshmallow test was is that they sort of saw impulsivity, and that was centered around they got like a group of like 5-year-olds, I think it was, and the 5-year-olds were sort of, they told the 5-year-olds that you could have the marshmallow now, or you can have 2 in an hour, so to speak, loosely speaking. And the children who were more impulsive chose the marshmallow now. The ones who kind of held back and said, well, actually, I want to do a good thing here, I can have 2 later. So
they
held
all
back.
found like their own little coping techniques.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Grabbing their hair or, dancing things on the table and things. They just found ways of coping to wait for the professor to come back in and say, right, you can have 2 marshmallows. one of the things that it says in the book is that that's something that carried on,
Yeah.
because they'd been tested.
No, they did. They did later. They did. Yeah,
And it was a trait that carried on throughout the whole
It is.
of their lives.
It's fascinating.
Once it's there, it stays.
It is, and it is interesting, and they sort of looked at things like years later, and for sure. Where it is concerned, so the research by Liddell, they talked about the correlation between EI and traits using the Goldman inventory, and it demonstrated a correlation between emotional intelligence and extroversion. There was a correlation between the two, which I'll sort of touch on more over the weekend. But one of the things about the model, by the way, is it's been proven to be able to adapt to the cross cultures and societies. So it's been proven to be effective across different cultures and societies. Albeit, I believe one research paper suggested there was a rural place in Bolivia where it didn't stack up for whatever reason. And that's a really interesting thing, because on the whole it's been shown to be adaptable across cultures, but there was a place in Bolivia somewhere that it didn't stack up for some reason. So, I can email that sort of paper too. Definitely. The research suggests there's a biological base, and it can be adapted across cultures, so whichever culture you're in. Costa McRae used statistics to calculate 5 personality dimensions, so it has that scientific base. So the stats that what began as a purely scripted model personality has become fundamental to psychology in that respect. What's really interesting too, I find, is so the research does say that women are more agreeable. Some research points towards than men.
I'd agree with that.
Yeah. I'm going to disagree. But that's obviously, it's not taking everyone specifically into consideration, but you would probably say, the research is the research. That's what it suggests. And there's implication for that, which we'll sort of touch on as we go along. Some things to consider, by the way. It's not a pathological model, by the way, but let's look at sort of some correlations here. That there was a paper by Costa McRae, and that sort of showed neuroticism is a trait associated to lack of emotional control, anxiety, and sadness. Okay, so there has been research suggests that the emotional control and neuroticism. So you might say, and that was a good point you made there about the Marshmallow experiments. Now, you would probably say that the young people who chose the marshmallows immediately might have had high scores in neuroticism, because the reality is that the emotional stability to hold back and wait for two. So there is that. And the correlation there 15 years later showed that sort of impulsivity was still there. So it's emotional regulation and neuroticism that have a strong correlation. That's for sure. But that's not all bad news. It's not saying one trait is good or bad. It's saying some have disadvantages and advantages. And bearing in mind, you sort of factor things in and think, okay, as a combination, so someone who's high in neuroticism is very conscientious, by the way, could have a really good focused direction. So, but things are going to, some things might be more suited to other things. So one thing to think about, in another paper, it showed that low scores to agreeableness correlates to poor academic performance and behavioural problems in school, suggesting higher scores of agreeableness in adulthood correlate more work stability in life and less maladaptive behaviour. So it's not a pathological model, but there has been a correlation to say that people with high agreeableness are less likely to develop depression, alcohol problem, but that's not a given. It's not pathological, but you sort of look at some of the research. So from an agreeableness point of view, it's probably going to provide more stability from a work environment, so they kind of get on with it and just, crack on.
Do people's scores in these different traits change over their life? Or do you think they're pretty
they say they're pretty stable. They're pretty stable. I mean, you can work on the behaviour, I guess, but from the point of view, the model suggests that the traits are stable. So if you're one thing at one point, you're very likely to be, you might moderate it, the environment might change, and you adapt to it, but there's a very good chance you'll pretty much be, according to the research, that's the sort of key. Other research too suggests that agreeableness has a strong correlation to work performance across many sectors. So if you're hiring someone going for a job and their agreeableness, then there's a very good chance they're going to, in that sort of role that's adapted to them, they're going to work well in that role. But equally, they might not be suited to other roles. where it might involve, say, a political role. It might involve a role where you want a higher continuing disagreeableness. So there is that too. But it makes a lot of sense that people are going to do better in certain areas if they are agreeable. Other research, I'm sort of showing some research, by the way, and I extracted some of this from a dissertation I did a while ago, just to sort of throw it out there and get everybody thinking, really. So Watson, Narragan and Gainey said that neurologism has the highest correlation, trace of psychopathology, suggesting scores high in neurologism has correlation with depression and anxiety. And also, that's quite interesting too, because it's not a pathological model in one sense, but there has been that sort of correlation in research. And it may be, I mean, if you've got low impulse control, you're probably more prone to anxiety, one would think. It would make a bit of sense to me where, okay, if you score on the higher end of neuroticism, there could be a correlation to anxiety. You sort of maybe find it harder to regulate your emotion in one respect. And that could mean that certain roles probably aren't suitable for you, one would think, in that respect. Because there is that sort of suggestion that it can be adapted cross-culturally. It's irrespective of what culture you are, these traits are, interesting stuff. So, other research suggested that people with conscientiousness and openness were identified in students who had profound interests. So, Skapansky and Bjornson suggested that conscientiousness and openness were high among students who had a profound interest in continuing academic education at graduate level. Say the high school students who were qualitatively assessed whether they wanted to go on to carry on with education, and they were found to be more conscientious and openness. Those two traits correlated with that. So you got like the 16-year-old or the 17-year-old who scores high conscientiousness and openness had a correlation to interest in pursuing graduate education. Okay, and also the other research by Bock and Roberts, 2013, suggests conscientiousness had a correlation with positive health, and suggests a correlation to several health conditions as well. Now, okay, that could be down to the person, multiple factors, but it could influence behaviour in the sense the person makes a priority of looking after themselves and doing whatever is necessary to there's no straight linear correlation here, but the evidence does suggest that there is, and it just could be that they are maybe innately focused and orderly and organised, and they're not sort of pushed from pillar to post, so to speak, in that respect. That's what the evidence says anyway. The other research by Pyropat suggests that there is correlation with academic achievement. I'm not banging the drum for these traits, by the way. I'm just saying what's out there in research, and you can find research in other areas too. But conscientiousness has a correlation with academic achievement, going forward. And see, when I wrote a dissertation a while ago on a particular group of people, and which I won't go into too much detail, who scored. They were conscientious on one level, but on the other level they weren't. And on this dissertation I did, it was a group of people that were indigenous, and they actually had to take responsibility much early on in life than people living in the other aspects of the environment. So they were very conscientious on one level, but when it sort of mapped out into academia, the correlation was lower in one respect, but that might be down to the burden or responsibility they had, if you want to call it that, at an early age to look after the family. So that's, you can have the paper, I can send it through if you want to. But the point being is that we go to other research, we'll see that agreeableness trait correlates to poor academic performance. Low score on agreeableness correlates to that. Okay, and so don't take it out on me. That's what the research says. Okay, don't make me the straw man for the research out there. I'm just quoting literature, which I do, having a background in science. But the low score on agreeableness trait correlates to poor academic performance, behavioural problems in school, suggesting high agreeableness in adulthood correlates with more stability at work life and less maladaptive behaviour. So I quote from literature because I can put my stamp on each trait, but I want you to see what the research suggests on each area. And if you look at that, it makes sense to a point, you would think, in that respect. So, okay, maladaptive behaviour being what one should be doing at a certain point in their life. So perhaps at 7-year-old, tying your shoelaces. By a certain age, you sort of do one thing or the other throughout life. At 15-year-old, you sort of know it's polite to hold the door open for someone. So the set of behaviours we can all sort of take into consideration, and agreeableness does correlate with behaviour in school. And probably beyond that too, I think, if the trait continues. So, okay, now I mentioned the Bolivia study there. That's what it was. It says how the FFM in a largely illiterate society in Bolivia. So that sort of raised question marks on validity. But I've said earlier before that I'm sort of getting you thinking now, is human behaviour it's hard to predict because there's so many range of choice at any given period of time. And also, you think aptitude test, you can sort of identify if someone's skilled in their area or field of knowledge. And cognitive test to measure an individual cognitive function across a certain area like speaking, spatial or reading, or whatever. So I want to sort of just retake before we sort of break for lunch, and we'll go into a little bit more detail after lunch and sort of bring it back again. Okay, so slide. So going forward. So is there any questions on? Anyone got any questions so far? Okay, so let's sort of just to summarise. Before we do an exercise. So some key points I want to make here as well is that genes explain a proportion of personality. It's important to note that. But I want you to sort of reiterate that any system out there, human behaviour, in my infinite wisdom, is probably too complex for any system to sort of explain anything, and that's irrespective of whatever research, because we know that we're a complex system. But in saying that, on the other side of things, it's a good indicator. Okay, so you've got the 6 facets. Okay, so if you want to go away and do some more research as well, you can sort of type in the NEO-PIR or the IPIP, which is quite useful. There are tests out there that have been adapted from the actual model itself, and you can have a go. So the 5 factors are, to reiterate, conscientiousness, neuroticism, extroversion, agreeableness, openness, okay, and they all have 6 facets. The NEO has different facets in some instances than the IPIP, okay, and you can read a lot more about what they entail too, and you can feel free to ask me. But I felt to sort of show you some stuff from the literature, it might be worthwhile. And just sort of very broadly speaking before we break for lunch, and I've got an exercise you can do after lunch too, just have a think. When I ask the question, how would you define who you are? In this context, have a moment to think, where you would score high in without going away and doing the 240 questionnaire or 60 modifiers questionnaire, whatever it is you decide to go and do. Have a moment to think from what we've touched on so far, where you think you would sort of score high and low in, and how that has an implication on your life in general, personally and professionally. Okay, have a moment to think. Okay. Who thinks, just as a show of hands, having gone through that at this point, will score high in conscientiousness? Okay, yeah. Anyone? Okay. So, who thinks neuroticism? Me. That's fascinating, yeah. Okay, that's really interesting. What about extroversion? Who thinks that score high in extroversion? Okay. Agreeableness? Score high. Yeah, okay. And what about openness? You score high. Okay, yeah. Okay, no, it's fascinating stuff. And I would encourage you, by the way, if you get time to have a go and look into it in more detail, certainly, and you can sort of go into the facets in more detail and go from there. So I've sort of thrown it out there, and I've been fairly balanced about it. I've sort of pointed the criticisms of the model, but also what I felt would be quite useful to do is to quote from the literature and show some examples of research and correlations and stuff like that. Do feel free to email me if you want more information on, anything I've sort of brought up so far, certainly. And, I'm more than happy to share some of my own independent research I've done in the area and send it across to you if you want to, which I sort of touched on as well. I think it's quite fascinating. I think it's quite useful in more ways than one, which I've talked about earlier, some of the ways that they can be used. But like all things I said before, it's really important that we sort of keep an open mind in one sense too, as well as that. So if we break for lunch, is it till 1:30 okay for everybody?
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll go from there.
I think we'll
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.